Mr. Mayor, you are live.
Thank you. Let's call the meeting to order. It's about 1:07. It's a special meeting, a work session of the governing body. It's a public meeting, but it is a formal meeting of the governing body. So let's begin by turning and facing the flag. We all constructively participate in the Pledge of Allegiance and the Mexico Pledge. On three. 1, 2, 3. Thanks, everybody. Let me open with a few table setting remarks, and then we'll hopefully get down to the study session. My hope for today, my expectation for today is a constructive conversation about chart, about the recommendations, about the report, and then secondarily and equally as important, how we move forward and bring the chart process to an additional round, more additional rounds of engagement, discussion, and ultimately, most importantly, action. I think we're ready to, as a governing body, talk about the priorities among us and between us for using this report as a springboard for priority actions. But today is primarily about dialogue and discussion. First, with our friends from Artful Light to get more context where possible. If there are additional contextual comments from items in the report, more color commentary, fleshing some things out. Not just questions and answers, but conversation. And then something we haven't done as a governing body yet is to have a dialogue among ourselves. We're going to talk about how we as a group and as a governing body can use this report and the year of work that went into it to establish directions for going forward. It's an open and transparent public meeting, which is how it should be. And it is the next step in an ongoing process. It's important, I think, to reflect on the fact that chart was never a one and done activity. It was the beginning of a much needed community dialogue. We are part of a national dialogue around history and hopefully around healing and less divisiveness, less anger and more respect and common agreement on who we are and how we live together in a constructive way. Many other cities have, over the last 2 years, been visited by demonstrations and in some cases tragic death. We used our demonstrations here and the activities that led to the tearing down of the obelisk, the illegal demolition of that monument. We used it as a opportunity, voted on unanimously by the governing body, to kick off a unique conversation among ourselves as a community about our history and culture, about the role that art plays in Santa Fe historically and going forward, and then how we can work collectively to a better understanding of who we are and how we live together peacefully and respectfully and constructively. I think it's unique in the country. I know from having researched truth and reconciliation activities in other cities and other countries that a very different approach has been taken in some places, including in North Carolina, in Canada, as referenced in the report, South Africa. But something like this is unique, and I think it is a document that, whether we agree with everything in it or not, is really not the point. I think the point is it provides us with a lot of opportunity to move forward together and to bring more people together around a joint series of activities, investments, programs and projects that will continue to make Santa Fe a leader in the world when it comes to celebrating diversity and making it a strength, making the things of Santa Fe special and continuing our history as a living embodiment of who we are. We are the beneficiaries of a document. I think it was put together as rapidly as possible. A number of people, not everybody, submitted questions, but per the request that was made, there were questions sent in to the Art for Life folks. And each of those has been responded to in writing. It's a public document. It's on the city's website. It certainly provides a lot of additional information and citations of where people can find in the report itself data or lists of recommendations and where they came from, and also clarified some of the questions around how choices were made among the participants in the chart process, all of which is on the table and on the web and available for public reading and engagement. We have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. I propose that we have 2 real agenda items today. They're equally important. One is a conversation with Art for Life, for which we appreciate you being here. And I propose we set aside the first 90 minutes of our 3 hours for that conversation. And then at that point, if we're at an acceptable stopping point, shift gears and talk among ourselves as a governing body about how we would like to move forward with next steps. I think there are lots of different ways to advance the cause that this report sets up for us to work on, but we haven't had a public conversation as a governing body about the way forward, and there may be different ideas about how to do that. So my proposal would be we spend 90 minutes moving around the table. There are 8 of us. If everybody took 10 minutes and had a conversation with Art for Life, it doesn't have to be a question, it could be a discussion. It could be I'd like more insight about what this means. And just move around the table, 10 minutes a person, respecting everybody's interest in having a chance to engage constructively. After 90 minutes, see where we are. I hope we will have had a productive dialogue, and then we'll shift gears to not so much speaking with Art for Life, but speaking with ourselves and among ourselves about the priorities and things that pop out for each of us around ways to move forward. So if that sounds agreeable to everybody, I think we can just take 10 minutes apiece for opening salvo and see where we are after 90 minutes. That's okay with everybody? Sound okay? Everybody okay? Yes? Good. Super. So I don't know. I'm looking on this side. Jamie, you want to start? You want to go first? It doesn't, you don't have to, as I said, this is a conversation and a dialogue. So we'll just start over here, start with you in the middle, maybe tee you up next, and just go around the table.
Okay, so first, we're really kind of, these are the questions, conversations, clarity. Okay. So I see that some of my questions were answered in this document. Thank you.
Counselor, if I could interject real quick, we would like to ask the deputy city clerk to take a quick roll call.
Good point.
Good idea.
Counselor Patrick,
I'm here.
Counselor Chavez,
Here.
Counselor Lee Garcia,
Here.
Counselor Michael Garcia,
Present.
Counselor Lindell,
Here.
Counselor Rivera is excused, Counselor Romero Burt,
I'm here.
Counselor Villarreal.
Present.
How about me?
Oh, Mayor Weber.
I'm present.
Thank you.
We have a quorum, and I apologize for skipping that step. We have to follow our own rules.
Can I just ask one other clarifying question?
Up to you.
Are we coming through on the web okay, or do we need to project more, or what's the level of, especially since
With
many of us
masks.
are wearing masks, I don't know, I can't see the.
And an owl in the middle of the
Mayor, Councilor Romero, that's a great question. So there are microphones in the owl.
Okay.
Alex, can you hear? I just did a gut check. Can you hear the counselors right now?
Testing.
Can you hear?
It's on one, you were-
We want to make sure that with masks on and one owl, we can be heard.
Yeah, if you see it, I can hear you a little bit better, of course, but it's all recorded harmony.
Sure.
I just don't want this to be a conversation where we're all murmuring.
You do not sound like a teacher from a peanuts cartoon.
Okay, that's
All right. And John, can we do a rough time check it, so that we try to stay with within a rough 10 minutes? It's not a rigid number, but about 10 minutes per person.
And then we'll kind of have time for just kind of general conversation observations later. So
Absolutely,
chat with you guys right now.
exactly.
So, one of the things that it is laid out here, and I think that this would be worthwhile because I know there's been I've received some questions about it, is discussion around the community solutions table and really how that was chosen. For anybody who is listening, that is on this FAQ that they provided. That is, I assume via PrimeGov is where this is accessible, so somebody can access it.
That is
PrimeGov.
correct.
But would you mind providing some information? Because I think that there was, I know for me, it was a different process than what I was expecting. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more about what was considered regular engagement, and then why was not everybody who consistently engaged able to be on the community solutions table for how you had designed it?
So probably the best thing is for us to read, because this is the most detailed and comprehensive.
Yep, this was a big one. That's why I
So,
pulled this one out.
Yeah, so I'll do that, maybe we can trade off. The members of the Community Solutions Table consisted of individuals who consistently engaged with the project and its range of activities, and were determined after the majority of the public engagement events had occurred. To abide by the contract, membership on the Community Solutions Table had to be diverse and representative of the Santa Fe community in age, gender, identity, sexual orientation, race, and cultural background. Also, in order to abide by the contract, the CST had to include a balance of perspectives and opinions on the city's culture, history, and stories, as well as a balance of perspectives on the obelisk and other monuments and statues of the community. That comes directly from the contract. In deciding on the makeup of the CST, as we call it, Artful Life considered the demographics of the city and county, including race, cultural background, age, sexual orientation, as well as those who had participated in the chart project up to the time the members of the CST were selected. We also considered the results of survey number 1, which told us which perspectives and opinions were important to chart participants. There were 600 or so respondents to survey 1. And people online and here can look at the table below for information about race and ethnicity in the chart project. So we had to balance a number of factors. What was the breakdown? And this one had to do with race and ethnicity in the city and county, who had attended our dialogues, who had participated in survey number 2. Those were the ones where we took demographic information. The dialogues was an approximation because we didn't require people to tell us their race and ethnicity. They could share on their registration forms, but we didn't want to be too much of a gatekeeper so that it would discourage people from participating. There's an entire section in the report on that, if people would like to read that, about gatekeeping and some of the research that shows how that can discourage people from participating. So we took demographic information on surveys and things like that involuntarily. So the chart dialogues that's in the middle of that table is our approximation of the people who attended. So we were looking at all of that. We also had to balance the size of the community solutions table with diversity. For example, a larger CST, let's say 30 members, would have required additional chart participants who identified, for example, as Black or African American. We located one chart participant self-identifying as Black African American who consistently participated in the project, while there were others who self-identified that way and maybe came to one or another event. And because the requirement was consistent, we had to count, in this example, someone who self-identified as Black African American as consistently participating. So we couldn't expand the size of the community solutions table without minimizing participation by people in terms of race and ethnicity. Does that make sense? So the larger, it would meant we would have had to have 3 or 4 who consistently participated as self-identified as Black African American. And that's why the size of the community solutions table was the size that it was. In terms of the work of the CST, members reviewed the body of data collected over the course of public engagement activities. This is the binder that was given, both of them, to each of the community solutions table members 3 weeks ahead of their first meeting. They were asked to study that because the community solutions table's recommendations to be responsible to the community engagement process, they had to know what information we had gathered. And that was important because this body decided against the idea of a board or commission for the chart project. And all of you decided in favor of a public engagement process that would listen to the stories of hundreds of people and let that be the base of the data for recommendations. So it's very important to point out that the community solutions table had to have its grounding. The members needed to have their grounding for their recommendations in the data that was collected during the project. Otherwise, they would not have been responsible to the hundreds of Santa Feans who participated in dialogues, art activations, surveys, interviews, and all of the other things. And just to finish, and they use this as a basis for proposing recommendations to be included in the final report. This process ensured that recommendations were based on the hundreds of responses by community members that reflected a robust and diverse public engagement process rather than the views of a few. This was the intention of the governing body when it rejected a process limited to a commission or board of a limited number of individuals. Much of the above information is presented on page 19 of the final report.
Yeah, I did see it on here, I have my notes, that I think that was just one of the areas that I know that I was a little bit surprised, especially because we had, there really was this conversation and there was the discussion if we had too many people that wanted to be involved, that this would be a good problem to have. I do understand there was a lot of data involved, but that was kind of an interesting conversation. I can really understand why any members of the public who have been watching our conversations around it, and then when we got to that kind of the process, how that felt a little bit different. So thank you for more of the information there. I'll jump ahead just because I know time is of the essence. Another question about who was chosen for the one-on-one interview. So I couldn't understand from the report if it was specifically, if there were individuals specifically that you guys reached out to based on trying to round out demographics. And I'm sorry, this one's coming in a little bit late. But could people have self-selected? Could they have nominated somebody for these one-on-ones? And were you taking anybody that had a recommendation or was interested in doing these? Basically, was there an open call for these? I came in late, so thank you so much.
We worked late yesterday to make sure.
Yeah, there's my second round of questions. I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
so I can read and then answer any questions, but finally, the 13 one-on-one interviews were conducted in May 2022 by CHART team members. These, they asked many of the same questions used in the January, February, and March public dialogue sessions. CHART sought out interviewees from demographic groups that had not participated in large numbers at other dialogues, including Santa Feans ages 20 to 29, immigrants from Mexico and Latin America, and Indigenous, Black, and Asian American residents. Interviewers asked 7 open-ended questions. The data from these interviews is also part of the large body of information collected by the CHART project and assisted in the formation of questions for survey 2. So
Yes, but what I'm still not understanding, could people self-select? So there's an open call that said, if you want to do one of these one-on-one interviews, or if you know somebody who should be part of these one-on-one interviews, was that an option or not?
That wasn't part of the formal one-on-one, but from the beginning of the CHART project, we, in all of our email campaigns, we said, if anybody wanted to meet with us, whether that was an individual or organization, all they had to do is contact us. In terms of these interviews that were done in May, late in the project, right? So how many months in, 10 months into the project, we had looked at who was missing in terms of contributing, or who we thought, the voices that we thought we needed to boost in some ways to try to achieve that balance. And that's how those participants were chosen. but anybody at any point in the project, and we did get people who we had individual phone calls with as well as meetings with throughout the project. So whether they call those one-on-one interviews, these more formalized interviews were with people that we thought that, or we sought out kinds of people that we thought would balance in terms of participation in the project.
And so then how, for those, maybe more ad hoc or more casual one-on-one conversations, how was that data and how was the information from them?
Notes,
Yeah,
we have notes from absolutely every interaction.
Okay.
Yeah, unless somebody called us, even if they just called us haphazardly on the phone.
Yeah.
If we set up something, it was either a Zoom or a phone call, and we took notes of all of those.
Okay. How am I on time? Okay, I will stop for now then.
I think if we keep this pace up, we'll maybe have a second round too.
Okay,
Mayor,
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, and I apologize. Could we ask our guests to introduce themselves and also?
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, we know who you are, but the public may not know who you are if they're watching on a Zoom or other screen. Please, just apologies again for not observing the niceties of our meeting. Well, just introduce yourself, please.
Sure, Ginny Scarab, I'm one of the co-directors of the chart project for Artful Life.
Valerie Martinez, and I'm the co-director for the chart project with Artful Life.
Alexis Kaminsky, I'm the external evaluator with Kaminsky Consulting.
Thanks. Sorry. So we'll try to stay within this rough framework, and I think it'll give a chance for more participation.
I have a few more if we have time.
Yeah, we'll try, I think if we keep a brisk pace going, we'll get maybe another round. Councilor Garcia, why don't you take the floor?
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, well, there's so many questions that can be asked. I think that, reading through the report and just kind of, going through my own thought processes and asking not just what was in the report, but what our community has been, reaching out to us, in a sense, because obviously, at some point, we, as a governing body, are gonna have to decide what's gonna go on with this. I know a lot of people were hoping that this report would identify, well, what do we do with the soldiers' monument? What do we do with the obelisk? What do we do with the statues in our community? The DeVargas statue, obviously, which is both sparked this conversation. And so I guess the question, and I don't have anything that I have sent in for preparation, so I hope we're gonna have to wing it here, but not wing it, but shoot from what some of the questions and concerns that I may have had over this process, but before I even go into this first question is, in the report, did we ever identify who owns the soldiers' monument?
That's a really good question, and so since the beginning of the project, chart was asked repeatedly, you know, if there were any limitations on what could be done with Soldiers Monument after it had been toppled, you know, who owns the space, so to speak, who's in charge of the space on the plaza. And so we forwarded that questions to our liaison, Pauline, in January, I think, because we kept hearing about it. So there is one of the recommendations in this report in the Soldiers Monument section that asks the city to be absolutely clear if there are any limitations, whether they're local, state, or federal laws or ordinances or whatever. Because what people were concerned about is that chart would do its work after all these months and come up with an option or another option. And then the answer would be, well, that can't be done because there are legal limitations. So we forwarded that question, I think, in January, and it's still in the report, the recommendations that be almost a prerequisite for action.
So that's never provided to you. Okay.
I think the question of ownership is potentially very distinct from the legal question.
Right.
And I'm not aware of any question of the ownership of the plaza. It's not questioned in the litigation on current law. I know we have some public speakers on that point, but the best information we have is the city owns the plaza in Outward. I don't give any contrary information to that. And I did reach out to Department of Cultural Affairs if they had any different information. Our staff has looked at the copies that the county So basically, our understanding is the city received the land, including everything on it, in 1901, from the federal government. And after that, we don't have any record of any further conveyances after that point. But certainly if anyone else has record of that, we'd be happy to look at it. My inquiries to the state have not resulted in any additional information. And nor has anyone, the current litigation doesn't suggest that the city doesn't own it.
Okay, thank you. I just think that that's such an important piece to all of this. And, you know, that being said, we're coming back up to what recommendations are. How do we take the information in this report and utilize it to make the best possible decision for our community? The other question I may have, or I've had, which is kind of similar to maybe what Councilor Cassidy was alluding to, which is inclusivity. And here again, I think that's some of the concerns from people in the community. And so there is a chart here where it shows that project activity, and it shows that community solutions table, there was only 3 sessions. How can you speak to that in terms of why there weren't more sessions that could have got possibly more information that could be utilized by us as a governing body?
We have a whole section on that in these answers as well.
Yes.
So it's in there, so all this and that's already answered.
Yes, someone else. You want to read or?
So this is on, I think this is sort of reflected by Councillor Garcia's question. Let's turn to page. Where is it? That talks about the approximate number of hours that the community solutions table members spent. So, sorry, this is on page 8. On page 7, I'm just gonna, if it's okay with you, Councilor Garcia, your question was, can you help me to understand how it was that in 4 hours of meeting, 2 hours on a Saturday and 2 on a Sunday, the community solutions table could, as a group, consider and or create 55 recommendations, some of them quite extensive and complex. And our response is, actually, the CSP met for longer than the times indicated on their agreement. Together, they agreed to stay longer on both days of the deliberations. The actual time was 6 hours of meeting time, supplemented by the hours they spent preparing for the session, the time they spent with homework after the first day of deliberation, and the many hours they spent writing and revising the sections of the final report with CSP recommendations. Recommendations were generated by a shared document that all panelists could contribute to, comment on, and revise over at least a month's time. The results became a significant part of the final report. We approximate that each member of the CSP spent an average of 25 hours on the process for a total of 150 collective hours. A few additional details: the CSP binder pages, 330 pages were distributed, as we said, 3 weeks ahead of time. They came to the meeting fully prepared to discuss the material with notes on paper and index cards, post-it notes in the report, and much more. As we said on August 31st, we were really impressed with the members of the Community Solutions Table, how they arrived at those meetings with just a lot. They had done their work, and that was just the beginning of the work. From that point on, we spent the 2 days in deliberations and then homework, as we say, and then they drafted the sections of the report that are the Community Solutions Table recommendations. Those are clearly identified in the final report, those that were created by the Community Solutions Table. They had to draft those, revise them, change them, comment on them in order to create the final version of that report. So just to go back, is that again, we were careful. This is on page 8 toward the bottom. It's also important to note that we often ask panelists to reflect on the information in their binders to ensure that their recommendations were in keeping with the results of the chart data. if the community solutions table members wanted to make a recommendation that we thought was not reflected in the body of data, they were free to do that. But as the chart team or the directors, we would have made note of that in the report. Because again, the responsibility of the community solutions table wasn't just to come and share their opinions. They all shared their opinions. They were part of the project. But their opinions had to be based on this information. So we worked very hard. There are many sections in the report on how we attempted to have diversity of participation in the chart project, right? That was the first priority, and that's why we worked so hard at that through many methods that are discussed in the report. That became this body of information. The community solutions table members, chosen also for their diversity and for their consistent participation, had to study this. Because if their points of view didn't seem responsible to this, the very reason Artful Life applied for this project is because of our expertise and experience in gathering information from communities. That's the work that we do. We do not use our own opinions to make data. We only consult the community to take their information. That becomes the collective voice of the community. That is the data of the report. And it would be very odd and irresponsible for us to then have a group of people come in and just say, well, we just think this, because it wasn't in the spirit of the project. All of the community solutions table members agreed with that, did their homework, and we served sometimes as a check on that during the discussions to say, do you think this is borne out in the information, right? We just had to say that over and over again. It wasn't that they came up with these recommendations that weren't consistent. It was our job to do that, to be responsible to the careful methodology of the process. That makes sense.
It makes sense, and I think that, I don't know where I am on time there, it's up.
Close by.
Just one comment, I guess, and maybe in form of a question is how many people do you feel might have been excluded because they weren't able to express, even though they may have, but it didn't get into the report based upon the criterion that was being set forth into what they wanted, what you were looking for and what they wanted to provide. Is there?
Yeah, I was about to say that, no, that everything that's in the report and everything in here reflects every single person who participated. There is nobody's voice who is left out. That is why the community solutions table was kind of like, they were like the apex, as it were, that took all this information that is the foundation of everything that's in the report. No one's opinion has been excluded in any way, shape, or form. That's why they looked at every survey result, every one-on-one interview. So I think I know that's sometimes hard to get around, but there's not a single person's opinion who is not reflected in there if they participated in either of the two surveys or a one-on-one interview. Everybody was heard.
No one was silent.
No one was
Believe us,
silent.
we collected all this information. We listened to it. We took all the
More
phone
than
calls. Yeah, so anybody who wanted to participate in chart could participate in chart. Not everybody who participated in chart could be part of the community solutions table for the reasons that we stated. But every person who spoke to us, every perspective or opinion, if they participated, was heard and documented. And it's part of the data that we submitted to the city of Santa Fe on August 31st, 2022 this year, when we delivered the final report. Again, the community solutions table had to do its work to study that material and form its recommendations based on that.
And you feel that was satisfied?
Yes, because we kept checking with them. Again, because we are so familiar with this information, because we've processed all of it and documented all of it. If there had been anything that the community solutions table said that seemed to us completely off, we would have said that as the co-directors in the report. We would have allowed that recommendation to exist, but we would have said that we don't think that's reflected in the information, but that never happened.
I'll yield the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilor Merritt, you want to just go around the table?
Oh.
You're not going in this distance?
Wanna go in that direction?
Well, you wanna go that way? I don't have a, I do not have a horse. If you'd like to go this way,
So you're going that way, that's. nice.
yeah, you're up,
Okay.
you win the prize.
Great, thank
You have the floor.
Thank you. I'm not gonna take off my mask, but, so tell me if you need me to repeat anything. So as I looked through the report, the common thing that I saw that was like alarming, but something that I think needed to be out in the open was that we have community members in many subgroups that don't feel their study represents them well. With that, I felt like, of course, it's our responsibility to kind of set that platform so they have a voice and they have representation and they feel like they belong to the city that they live in. Working in the community as I have, I know how essential community partners are to create that platform. It is hard for, I think, government organizations to make the kind of connections that community partners do with community members. And many of them target subgroups that are often not represented well and experience inequities and experience silent voice. So their work, community partners' work is just so essential. And I know there was a long list, and I'm sorry I didn't get my question to you ahead of time, I apologize. There's a long list of organizations and community partners that were involved in this process. But when I was looking at that, I was very curious to how many of them were aligned and what they thought was best with some of the hot topics like the uplift. Because, you know, as a city government, we're gonna have to create action. I don't think we can do that without community partners. And if our community partners aren't aligned, we're kind of gonna be in the same spot that we were in the first place. So I just wanted, if you can, just from the work that you did, give us a summary of how the work with some of our community partners were, if you felt resistance from any of them, if there's anything we should know in reaching out to our community partners and trying to create action out of this whole process. Well, so there was a lot of them here, but I imagine they all had different levels of participation. I know some of them, it was limited to them really just being reached out to and maybe them saying they didn't want to be that involved. So I want to understand how each of them were involved and to what level.
Well, in our response here, we have the list of the organizations, how we reached out to them, and then the ones that responded, and we met with all of them. In terms of, I think, the first part of your question, what we heard over the course of the chart project, and I think this is in the truth and reconciliation sections of the report, there's diversity all around. So even within organizations that we met with, sometimes people had diverse perspectives, different perspectives. For us, this work is really about community building in communities that do not have the same points of view. That is the hard work. So the chart process was to give everyone a space and to create safe atmospheres where they could say what they had to say. We did not, if people were horrible to each other, that just actually didn't happen. Sometimes people who showed up to protest the chart project but didn't participate said really awful things to people and to our staff, but they weren't the people who participated. So everybody, including organizations that participated in the chart project, we found overall, and Denise just, you know, say it differently, but I think they were in it for the hard work. And as I said on August 31st, these weren't people who were like, kumbaya, this is great, we're all the same, we love each other. That was not what we heard, whether from organizations or individuals who participated. They understood, most of them, that the truth-telling part of this was painful and is where we are now, that we're not at reconciliation, that the truth needs, whatever the truth is, your truth, the truth you perceive, is where we are, and that we see this reflected right in everywhere right now. It's tough. it's hard to listen to people's truths sometimes. But we found that there was not only a diversity of views within organizations often and in the group, but that people thought this is going to be hard and it's going to take time and it needs to be deliberate. It needs to be delicate. It needs to be not rushed. And that's the way, not only that you get to places where there may not be agreement, but there's community building. So that's what we heard. We didn't hear monolithic answers to almost anything. So we couldn't even say, I can't. That when we met, even with an organization, they were all on the same exact page. But it's very important because the work that you have in front of you, because of this report, and we think that the report really states this and reflects it, is going to be difficult. Any option with Soldiers Monument, people are not going to be happy. It doesn't matter what you decide. So it's almost a moot point. This is just me personally saying this, because community building has to happen regardless of a decision that you make about Soldiers Monument, because somebody is not going to agree. So, and I've said this to maybe some of you, one of the persons who trained me in facilitation, Selena Cermeño, has worked with the United World Colleges all over the world, and she's worked with Palestinian and Israeli youth, where there is no resolution. There won't be an agreement. And so what she teaches is the stamina to stay with the conversation, the stamina to stay with the difficult work. And that's something that we tried over the chart process by giving people equal time to speak and asking people to listen more, sometimes to things that were hard for them to hear, because you're never going to have agreement, I don't think, on what happens with Soldiers Monument, but we still have a community here, a beautiful, rich, contentious, diverse community. So how do you build the connective tissue between people who do not agree? And the only way to do that is to maintain dialogue. The last recommendation in this report is for a very robust Department of Community Engagement. It's not just outreach. It's about knitting together a community of people who do not have the same views and doing the hard work that it takes to do that. That is the undertaking. And CHART began that process by creating safe spaces for people to speak what they had to say in a situation facilitated so they didn't get attacked or hurt or harassed. That's what we did, and we were careful, and those organizations were part of that, and individuals were part of that. But that's the work. It's not quick work. It's hard work because it's about community building. It's not about easy answers to very difficult questions.
And the truth process needs to be ongoing. You know, that's another thing is like this idea of people feeling like they're not heard or represented. That's going to be ongoing, especially in Santa Fe, because I feel like we are a city and our face changes often, right? We've grown and we've evolved and we're constantly evolving, we're growing, and people are going to need a platform to share their truths throughout that journey. I think this experience is not just a moment in time. It's like a process that needs to continue. And we have a lot of amazing things occurring in the city, happening in the future that we're already planning towards and working towards. And just being mindful of how do we allow that to serve this purpose of continuing creating this platform for the many colors of Santa Fe, right? That's something that's really beautiful about our city. The many colors of Santa Fe to feel free to share their truths and educate community members and what Santa Fe is to them and what they need it to be. So I value the truth and the fact that every single subgroup really felt like the city didn't represent them to the fullest that it could have, or they didn't feel like they had a voice to the level that they needed. That I think could define everything we do if we just continue to listen to that fact and that truth as we build and move in the direction that we're moving in. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Council. Over to Steve. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Minsky, Ms. Martinez, Ms. Garrett. Really appreciate you being here with us today. And I appreciate the responses to the questions that I had submitted. I guess maybe I'll start with one of the questions I had submitted in our handout. It is on page 6, I think, and this kind of continues some of the dialogue we talked earlier regarding the community solutions table, because that is the solid foundation of what was supposed to bring forth recommendations to us in regards to reviewing data collected, taking it, synthesizing it, and providing recommendations to us as the governing body. And so with that, my question revolves, it's for folks that might be following along, it's the second question. And the question reads, through IPRA requests, it came to the public's attention that there was a non-disclosure agreement for Valerie Rangel, who is the city historian and a participant in Awful Life. Can you help to clarify her role with the community solutions table? And so it goes on to say, a non-disclosure agreement signed by members of the community solutions table did not and does not exist. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Valerie Rangel participating as an individual met the requirements to be considered for the community solutions table. I'm going to stop there because the rest, it kind of just goes on to justify why she was selected. I have very, very deep concerns about that appointment. Ms. Rangel, in my opinion, that appointment would be just like appointing one of us as a counselor or Ms. Kamiyama. She is on our side of the fence. I recall she even participated in some of the updates to us. I think it might have been the November update to the governing body. And that to me is wrong. I don't know if others see it in that manner, but Ms. Rangel should not have been a member of that panel. She has major influence over this process, and that influence could have been exerted over the participants. And so, besides what you stated here, can you tell me why you felt it was justified to appoint in this body that started off with 9 individuals, shrunk down to 7 out of the 1,000+ applicants? Why Ms. Rangel needed to be there versus anybody else?
So my question to you is, what perspective or point of view do you think Valerie Rangel represents that you think would have unduly influenced the community solutions table?
It's a conflict of interest of the perspective of the public, and from my own personal opinion, looking from the outside in, that is an absolute conflict of interest. From hearing, excuse me, Ms. Martinez, 1 second, I got to finish, because hearing from a participant that was in the community solutions table, she was the dominating conversation in that process. And again, that influence that comes along, I'm very, very disappointed that happened. There was, as you mentioned, 1,400 folks that participated, and I'm surprised that we couldn't put one other person besides Ms. Rangel in that position, because it allowed one more person from the community to participate versus, in my opinion, an absolute conflict of interest.
So you were not present at the community solutions table deliberations, is that correct?
No, I was not, but I spoke with somebody who was.
So I'm just wondering, so again, what point of view do you think Valerie Rangel represented on, though you weren't there, on the community solutions table? And what point of view is that you believe unduly influenced these deliberations and the recommendations in this report?
The perspective that could come from the city, as somebody who is a representative of the city should not have been a participant in the community solutions table. It's the same as Councilwoman Villarreal, Councilor Chavez, myself. I could have met the qualifications.
Yes,
but
you
we-
could
we-
have. You could
That's
have.
not,
And
that's.
in fact, all of you were invited to participate in every aspect of the chart project as a resident of the city of Santa Fe. All of you could have participated because your perspectives and opinions and points of view are valid. You would not be speaking for anybody else because that wasn't allowed. We didn't, people spoke for themselves during this project. They did not speak for anybody else but their individual points of view. And for those of you who are watching and don't know, Valerie Rangel is the city of Santa Fe historian. I don't know if her term's up or it continues. So is that what you're saying, that the city of Santa Fe historian point of view would have unduly influenced the members of the community solutions table?
It could have, as well as a person who was helping to facilitate the process. As I noted, she was a presenter as part of the chart team. And that's what she was identified as, part of the chart team.
She's not
So-
part of the chart team.
Then why?
She's not a staff member of Artful Life.
She was
she's not
working
a-
with Ms. Kamiyama.
She's not,
Is that correct?
she's a participant in the chart process, just like everybody else, and she consistently participated in chart activities in different kinds, not only dialogue. So if you would like to discount Valerie Rangel's point of view, then who others should we discount who participated consistently in the chart process and why? So I would say there is no reason why we would disqualify Valerie Rangel as a member of the chart process or any other participant. We were looking for those who had consistently participated. She is an Indigenous woman who consistently participated in the chart process. So she was chosen in part because she shared her demographic information. Again, we were trying to achieve a balance. But because you weren't present for the deliberations, you're sort of, I don't know, secondhand information. But we can assure you that everybody who participated in the community solutions table had equal time to speak, disagree with each other, and shape the recommendations. And we stand by that process. We were both there for all of the hours of that deliberation. And if we thought there was any undue influence by anyone, we would have raised that as a concern, and that did not happen.
Thank you for that. And last on that point is, I will refer folks back to our November 1st quarterly briefing. She was part of the briefing to us. So that's the last point on that I'll make to us.
That has nothing to do with the chart project or our.
It did, because it was when the facilitators were introduced to us. I remember her explicitly, and it's in the paper, it was printed in the media.
Yes,
that
it was
she-
incorrect.
It was incorrect. They mistakenly, it was Valerie Martinez.
And they
We
called me
complained
back.
they called her Valerie Rangel. We
Okay.
complained to the paper. And the editor actually took the reporter off of the chart project, because he messed up so badly, basically, in doing that. And they never actually, put out
Corrected that.
a retraction. So
Okay,
she was not part of it. They meant to say Valerie Martinez.
thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Two outstanding questions, and maybe one since it's for staff, I'll ask it later since we were asking questions for chart folks now. One of the questions I had asked, and this was, I had asked about the number of the recommendations that came from the community solutions table, and it came back that there was 21. So I would put forward that when we approved the chart process, we agreed that we would take recommendations from the community solutions table. That's where they would come from. So I would say we've got 21 recommendations to move forward with, not 50 plus, because the other 30 some odd aren't coming from the community solutions table, which we dictated through the resolution we approved. I was only able to find 19 going through this. Can you help me identify the other 2 that I wasn't able to identify? Because you say on truth, there was and maybe I'll work with you offline to get this answer, but I only found 19 that came from the community solutions table per the reporter. If you can help me identify the other 2, I would strongly urge us as a governing body, we move forward with those 21. That's what the community solutions table deliberated and recommended. Everything else, thank you for the work on the matter, but I think we need to move forward with the recommendations put forth by the community.
If you do that, then you nullify the part of the body of data that we collected. Because as explained in the answer to these questions, the community solutions table reviewed the material, and the methodology sections tell you that the questions on survey 2 were designed to confirm the data that we had collected over the course of the project. We told the community solutions table that every single question in survey 2 would be addressed and discussed in the final report, which it was. So the community solutions table identified the priorities for them, which were 21. They could have added the rest of them to it, but because we were going to report on the results of survey 2 based on the data, they wanted to concentrate their effort on the 21 that they articulated. It doesn't mean that the other recommendations were not created by all of the people who participated in the report. So I would argue that if you want to exclude those, then you are excluding hundreds of stories and voices and perspectives of the people who devoted their time voluntarily to this project. I would object, and I object vociferously, that any of the recommendations based on the body of data collected will be ignored. And I would ask from you to take each one of those recommendations and explain to us and to the city of Santa Fe, all the chart participants and this body, why those recommendations should be ignored. And I will ask you to do that work, and we're happy to talk with you and in a public session, hear from you about all of the other recommendations based on this body of data that you would like to be dismissed for no good reason, in my point of view.
Ms. Martinez, I take severe objection to that comment, saying, I don't want anything that's not coming from the community solutions table to be considered at the moment. By no means am I dismissing any of the data, any of the stories. You're taking my words out of context and misconstruing them, which is wrong. So what I'm saying is, because the community solutions table did not put forth a recommendation, we can take that information and talk about it later, but we need to focus on what the community solutions table deliberated and recommended. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying any of the information should be dismissed, so please don't misconstrue my words. Talking about the survey, and it's a question in here regarding the responses. I find severe question regarding why we're allowed for folks to provide more than response on some questions, some are not. It calls into question the integrity of the survey and
Counselor, thanks for your last question, because we're.
Sure.
It's point of order, I'm not sure how long this is going on, but feel like we haven't gotten.
Sure, I'm sorry, Mr. Blair did give me a heads up, so I apologize, but with that being said, I think there's still lots to be discussed. We've got, in my opinion, 21 things to move forward with. Thank you for the time. Thank you for coming to provide additional feedback to us. With that, I yield the floor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We got-
Thank you all for joining us. And it's helpful to look at this again for me.
there's still more things that I just wanna dig in. I think the appendices, I didn't really have time to dig into. And I think when I look at the recommendations based on theme, whether they're the 21 recommendations from the community solutions table or the ones that have come out from the community process, I think they're all valid. Especially because, or particularly because a few of those things, I would say a considerable amount of the recommendations are things that we have heard in the community already. They're not new information, they're not new recommendations, they're things that have been issues for a while. They're actually things that haven't been dealt with in our community, and I think they need to move forward. So I think just trying to distill between those recommendations is going to be hard, because I think there are some things that community solutions table we need to, there's a priority level there, and then there's a priority level for some of the things that we need to undertake. And I guess when I think about the questions, and I want to review the questions that my colleagues submitted, because I haven't been able to look through this whole document. I apologize, you didn't get my questions ahead of time. 2 days, I already talked to the city manager about this. 2 days is not, 2.5 days is not enough for those of us that have other jobs to submit questions to you by the Friday deadline. So I'm providing my questions today. And I think I'll yield on some of the questions I had about community solutions, because I think you answered them, and I'll have to look at those more thoroughly. I think what I was trying to put together or understand a little bit better is through the process itself, and whether it was the community involvement process or the distillation of the data that was provided. I was curious how Alexis Kaminsky kind of fit into the picture, because we haven't heard much from you, but I know you were the main evaluator. So I guess I was trying to, would love to hear more about your process and how your evaluation role was integrated into it, along this, not just the community engagement, but also like the data collection and even the community solutions section of that as well.
Thank you, Counselor. So my role, as I understood it, was to make sure that the questions that had been asked by Artful Life were not biased in any particular way, and ensure that people could respond. And so that was one thing I did, was to make sure that over the course of the project, that questions that were asked were understandable by a wide variety of people who live in Santa Fe, but also didn't point people in a particular direction of how they should be answering. That was one of my roles. The other role was to make sure that there was that Artful Life was reaching the diversity of Santa Fe that exists in this community. So looking at the demographic data that had been collected to identify whose voices were not well represented. And then Artful Life took that information and would modify their outreach efforts and engagement efforts in an effort to really try and bring in those voices that hadn't come to the project itself. And then also working with them on the second survey to make sure that the questions were understandable and based on what had already been learned, and to further document a broader perspective of more people, because there was some concerns that the qualitative data could be very, I guess people would say maybe subjective. So to make sure that there were numerical data to either substantiate or to substantiate or to invalidate other things that have been said in the past. And we really didn't have that much. It was very interesting how the quantitative data really dovetailed with the qualitative data. It was surprising to me in some ways.
And, do you do your kind of separate evaluation from the team, or how did it function? Like, the practicality, I guess, of it for you, did you communicate with the team about your evaluations? Like, were you constantly checking in, or did you do your own kind of
I
evaluation?
did
separate?
my own work, but we did stay in regular communication, because a good evaluator, you need to stay in contact with the people who you are the evaluator. Otherwise, my work could end up being totally irrelevant. I wanted to make sure that it contributed to the process.
And for the community solutions section, were you involved with that process as well?
That came towards the end, and mostly what it was making sure that all the documentation that had been collected over the course of the project was provided. And making sure that the criteria that was used to identify potential participants was robust and made sense based on participation and diversity.
I don't know if you wanted to talk about survey number 1, too, in a little bit. I know it's in the report, but your work on that.
If you care to hear more about survey 1, I've worked with a handful of the chart facilitators, in part because, you know, what having one person trying to make sense out of everything can end up being very narrow-minded. So I had a few other people from the chart project work with me to identify the recommendations that had come out of survey 1, which were really a lot. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of them. So the fact that there are only 50 in this report, they were condensed. And then spent a significant amount of time with a program called Deduce, which is a way to analyze qualitative data that is very rigorous, to make sure that the themes that were being reported on were actually grounded in the data, that a breadth of responses were presented for each kind of theme, instead of just having one perspective. We had the range of perspectives, and making sure that all the written responses were accounted for.
Thank you.
Mhm.
The other question I was curious about participation in the various platforms, were there any city staff that participated in any of the community engagement
We
activities?
don't know.
We didn't ask.
We didn't ask people's jobs, so.
We hope so.
I hope so. We did send to the city information about the survey and different things like that, and for them to send out to the list of city employees, because of course, it's a big number of city employees here, and, that hopefully live in Santa Fe, but we don't know how many actually participate.
And Valerie Rangel, I guess I'm just surprised that became a hot button, because she's not a staff person. She's pretty much a volunteer for the city as a city historian. It's a contract. I don't even know the term of that. So I don't really know what to say with that. I actually know Valerie as a planner, and she's a really good one. In her background, she's Indigenous and Latina. So yeah, I guess I don't see I respectfully have a different opinion about it from my colleagues. And I wasn't there. I wasn't part of the community solutions table, so I don't really know what the dialogue was, or the disagreements, or people feeling like there was an imbalance, or maybe they felt like it was balanced. So I just have to, from this side of things, and all of us really have to trust the process, even though, it's like we have to hope that everyone was included. And, we hope that everyone's included when we're on a council, and that we're representing our constituents well too. So that's, some people may disagree and some people may agree. So, but the other thing I was curious about, because it's the process, I told you all in the last meeting that trying to fit a process with community engagement in a resolution structure that may be restrictive for you all,
that may not serve the public as well as it could be as if it was separate and you all decided to work with community groups to lead this process instead of kind of a government structure. So I'm curious, did you get any feedback about this process or chart in general or reconciliation and feeling that it shouldn't or couldn't occur in a government or a political setting? Was there any like feedback about that?
Oh, I think there's plenty of,
I know I didn't, it probably was in it, but I'm just wondering if you could glean from some of the feedback you got.
let me say this, there's plenty of, I think, we all know, ordinary or common belief that bureaucracies don't do a good job of this. That's why the fact that you as a body turned away from a board or commission and contracted for a community engagement process was a very good thing. When I told my colleagues in this field that I was going to apply for this RFP, they told me it was crazy not to do it, that they wouldn't pay attention to your recommendations, that bureaucracies don't know how to do that, that city councils everywhere are dysfunctional. And it was hard. It was a very hard decision for Artful Life to submit our RFP and decide to do so, because we believe in the process that we have stuck to for all the criticism, and we believe in the data that we collected. And I believed, perhaps naively, and even at this point, after all of the flack that we have taken and some of the really awful things that have been said to us, not unfamiliar to us in doing this work, but I believe that we did what Artful Life has been committed to for many years, and we did it faithfully. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we did our job. And the fact that we did this as a contract on behalf of this governing body feels to me like a positive thing. And Mayor Weber, I want to agree with you. We looked at these processes all around the country over the course of this. We did not see a process exactly like this anywhere in the country. And not to say that all of the others were bad, but oftentimes the decisions about their monuments were left to politicians or elected officials, or they were taken down and we just had to deal with it. So the fact that you did it, I think you are to be commended. And we did it our way. You allowed us, and there was space in this contract. Every contract obligation is in this report for those of you that are watching and those of you who are sitting here. Every single one. What we were required to do, how much the community solutions table decisions had to do with the final report, which is stated clearly here. It didn't say anything that only those were to be taken up in the final report. We followed this, but we did it the way that Artful Life does its work, which is to listen to the people and to present what they have to say as a collective voice. So, all to say, with all the disbelief in institutions and in governing bodies and in bureaucracies, we believe that we did this work in a way that reflects the collective voice of the Santa Fe community, those who voluntarily chose to participate. That is a sign of hope. If you do not take up these recommendations, it will be really sad. And that will confirm some people's opinions that you can't believe in a process like this that was inclusive as much as possible in 12 months and has given to you these recommendations. That's why it's so important. That's why I get emotional, Councilor Garcia, and I'm sorry if I do. But we have worked very hard. And if you do not take these up soon and act on them, then it sends back a message to the community that you really don't believe in this process of listening to hundreds of people's voices, that you think that it has to be flawed, or it has to be political, or it has to be bent toward a point of view. It was not. Nobody was allowed that undue influence because everybody had equal time to speak and people had to listen, and we documented all of it. And that's what the Community Solutions Table was responsible for reflecting, and that we're responsible for reflecting. And if you don't believe we can do that, take a look at the work of Artful Life over the years. We have a track record, and we know how to do this. But please encourage people to believe in this kind of community engagement process. So I commend you, and then we charge you with turning to the recommendation.
Thank you. I think like processes like these are flawed only because there's a human element to it. And when there's a human piece to it, then I think it's just, then there's different, there'll always be different perspectives. And I think there are some folks, and maybe even folks in the governing body, that put stock in that this process will solve all issues. I don't know if all of us thought that, but I think it's really just, it's one step to such a bigger piece. And I guess what was clear in the document for me is that we're a fractured community, and we have been for a long time.
Mhm.
So I don't know.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. I will read these because there were some things I just wanted clarity on, for the questions, and yeah, I think I'll stop there if we have more time.
Yeah, try to get another little bit. Yes, sir. You go.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for being here today. This represents, of course, a mammoth amount of work. It makes my dissertation look like a little paper booklet someone put together and handed in Friday. I look, some of my concerns about this are, somewhat philosophical, that, I think that, I'm not sure, I think that you did a terrific job on doing what you were asked to do. I'm not sure we asked for the right thing. I don't know that. But I think you completed certainly the RFP and, with flying colors. But I don't know for sure that we asked for the right thing. We had 1,400 participants, and I don't know that 1,400 participants, we have a population of 84,000. I don't know. And you said today that people that didn't participate were there saying awful things. We completely believe you. But they're still saying something. They're still a part of. And that's my concern, is what we go through every day, whether you're a public servant here, whether you're a public servant on a state or a federal level right now, that a term a fairly new term to me is alternate facts. I don't know about alternate facts. Those are lies to me. And when people fill out surveys now or give their opinion, I mean, we have a very sizable population in this country right now that thinks that Joe Biden is not duly elected as president. And it concerns me when we do surveys and we ask people their opinions. I don't know, but there's a lot of that process that's gone haywire for me. It worries me. It worries me a lot. Because I do know that the people that said horrible things to you, they're still a part of. They're part of this community. They have a strong opinion. They didn't want to participate, but they're still a part of. I don't have an answer about that. I'm just making some observations that the idea that the other thing, the one thing specifically though, that in a larger 40,000 foot view of this is the recommendations were put forth with, no constraints and no limits. To implement all of these recommendations will be tens and tens of millions of dollars. And the folks participating didn't have the constraints and the budgetary considerations that the folks at this table have. What gets funded and what doesn't get funded? Because these recommendations, some of them are extremely expensive. So that some of them don't get, I mean, there's a lot of them. There'll be a lot of them that don't get implemented in the near future or even in the long future. To say that, we're disregarding what the public says, that's not really, I don't think that's true. I really don't. And I think that that's a little harsh on this council. We have an awful lot of considerations. And this is, how many recommendations to consider? I mean, like I said, it's tens and tens of millions of dollars. You made a statement about the stamina to stay with the work. This council showed a lot of stamina on a lot of days. And I think that one of the things for me is, and it's one of the questions I asked, and I was referred to a specific page in the report, which certainly I had read, but until we address what we're going to do on that plaza, we will remain in some turmoil and continued divisiveness. And the idea that people are gonna agree on what the decision is laughable. There will be people that will be so mad. They will feel so betrayed. And I have no idea what will be proposed, but they will be so mad and so betrayed. They may never, ever be able to feel a part of again. And that's phenomenally sad. But I think that has to be addressed, or we continue, the chasm will get greater. Walking onto the plaza, and seeing a box, that's gotta change. It's gonna be a very, very hard decision. So I don't really have questions, mine are more comments. I don't know that in the recommendations, I mean, some of the areas that were broken down into, I mean, public art, is that going to, is that, we already have a pretty sizable commitment? Is that what's going to make the difference in this community? I don't know. In the facilitators, I think 10 of them have a background in arts. I mean, why, of course this would be, kind of art directed. It's, was under arts and culture, the name of your company is Artful Life. And I'm just saying, I'm not sure that we asked for the right thing, and I don't know what the right thing was. but I was certainly hopeful that on the, obelisk, on the Soldiers Monument, on the plaza, that I guess I would have liked for, a clearer outcome or a clearer charted course of how to get to that outcome. So those are my comments, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just make a quick response
Yeah.
about the importance of public art? You know, one of the reasons that public art is highlighted so much in this report is because the monument actually falls under public art, as do the Cross of the Martyrs. So the rules and regulations around the city, around public art are key to this process, and about what the city, you know, can and cannot do with public art. That's really key, and also how to deaccession public art is a big thing that's going around the country right now for just these reasons. There is no rule right now for deaccessioning public art in Santa Fe for these kinds of reasons, if the decision is to remove the obelisk. So there are a lot of rules there and regulations and processes that need to be built up in the city in order to make whatever changes that you want to do, and to understand and lay on top of that the historic preservation, also rules, which comes also under arts and culture, whether it's at the Department of Cultural Affairs in the state, you know, or here, might be separate here in the city. But that's why that is so key, especially if you want to focus on the Soldiers Monument. That department, the regulations, that exist, are key to what you can and cannot do to remove public art or to put public art in place. So I would just say that that is really a key piece in this, and that information is available. There are statutes, you know, in lots of states and in lots of cities that can help that process, but it needs to be looked at and really gone through. What is the process for deaccessioning or for accessioning public art? And then what are the criteria? Should something need to be removed or something actually put into place that is new? This is all around public art, all existing within the Department of Arts and Culture here. So that's one of the reasons that public art is so important as part of this process. So I would certainly not ignore that in any way, shape, or form. And that can happen right away.
I think our city attorney raised her hand.
I do think it's what I heard, our microphones are not necessarily attached today. You're right. We're very quiet and these microphones aren't necessarily helping. So certainly I think the deaccession policy of the city would be very important. It is not clear to me, and I'm not aware of any source that says that the monument or the Cross of the Martyrs is public art of the city. I haven't looked into the Cross of the Martyrs at all, but the monument is defined as an object in the city's code under the historic preservation code. I don't know how it's possibly involved in city's public art because
They're both listed in the list of the city's public art. Both those are where, yeah, there's a list, there's on the website, I'm sure Colleen can bring you there. There's a list of, I think, 47 objects in the public art collection, and both of those are listed there. So whether that's incorrect or not, but that's what is out there.
if I may explain, there was prior 2 years back, a survey of the monument memorials within the city, and that is just one of them. They're not necessarily, were commissioned under the public art policy, but because we are the department, I'm looking to make sure that we have stewardship over monuments memorials, so that we can ensure that they are taken care of, if they're tracked and documented. Okay, so I'm aware of that survey, and it was involved monuments and other items. I don't think it had any legal significance as to anything that's on that list or not on that list.
It is published that way. I'll send you that one.
Thank you.
I've seen the list, but it wasn't the document as a particular type of holding of the city. There's an inventory of what was in the city.
Thank you.
Your point's well taken, and I have had some back and forth emails recently with City Attorney McSherry about our obligations with public art and all those kinds of different things. So it's not that it's new or being ignored. I mean, it is in process.
Thank you, Mayor.
Marilyn?
My questions are gonna be kind of big, so I'm gonna ask you to be as succinct as possible so I can get them in my 10 minutes. First one, quick question, and this may be for the city attorney, just to characterize, the plaza is considered a park, correct?
Mayor Weber, Councilor, that's correct.
That's what the city park,
Correct.
okay. I think it's important that people know that. I want to focus on your familiarity with the data, the responses, your engagement with the community, your knowledge of all that you've collected, all that's here in this report. I'm interested in how we tell a more comprehensive, expansive, fuller tale of our city and the people who make up our community. How do we represent the various lived experiences? How do we capture the history from different perspectives, recognizing that depending on where you sit or sat, the events that have transpired in our very long history felt different, were experienced differently. And I'm curious, kind of, I know this is a big question, and I'm just curious, in this public meeting, if you could maybe hit, doesn't have to be a comprehensive list, but hit a few things that you think might be important for us to consider as we think about how we share, capture, present more varied history.
Well, I'd say if you read the introduction to this report, the introduction to the history section, probably the introduction to the culture section, that those sections of the report were very carefully articulated to do exactly what you are saying, to represent what we heard, and to do that in the context of history, in the context of the history and current population of Santa Fe, as well as the ancient history of Ogopoge / Santa Fe after colonization. So because that's a hard thing to answer, I do think that the report addresses that in the introductions to the section.
And there isn't anything in particular you would highlight, recognizing, of course, there isn't one thing, right? I'm just curious, I want to take advantage of your experience, your knowledge, your. I would just add that, one of the things that we heard a lot was people want, places to share their stories, and things like that. But what we also knew is there already exist a lot of places where stories are shared about Santa Feans, whether it's the Living Treasures, which is over, I think, 150 Santa Feans, which, a lot of this we tried to share on our blog. Where were the repositories of those that already that exist that maybe people didn't know about it, whether it's the History Museum or the archives, a lot of the digital ways that people have already recorded their stories and their histories that could be brought together or the community could know more about. Of course, they suggested, was a history museum, which could encompass many of these things, together. So a lot was actually really we already have a lot here. But a lot of that isn't necessarily known by, quite a few people. That those kinds of things. The other thing was understanding the difference between wanting to share your story. And then, of course, we'd ask, who do you want to share it with? Who's going to listen to your story? But this idea too, whose stories are you listening to? It's a little skewed with, I want to share my story, but I'm not really going to listen to somebody else's story in that way. So there's this learning to be able to do both, that I share my story and then I listen to your story, which is part of the facilitation process that we did, so that you're almost doing more listening than you are, actually sharing. We did try to include also in our blog different historical perspectives from different Santa Fe historians, Andrew Lovato, others, voices of Pueblo women, so we tried in a microcosm to begin to put that out there, that these things exist, these resources exist, these YouTube exists, these people are already speaking these things, but they're not necessarily coming together and shared out, that all of this, is actually really out there, basically, but how to actually socialize that to a place maybe where somebody could actually go if they wanted to. And of course, everybody has different learning styles. Some want to hear in person, some, some can do online, some, so you have to really take all that into consideration as well. Someone to read a book, there's tons of books. We shared, I don't know how many books, 25, 30 books, a lot of them on Santa Fe history from different perspectives, whether the French history of New Mexico, Hispanic history, Native American food, so we were trying to bring them together in the cultural history series. And to kind of give an example of how this could, how this could work, to share that information a lot more.
I would just echo what's been said here, and one of the other things that's come up that hasn't been specifically mentioned is the importance of having multicultural exchanges, so different groups are not just segmented into different areas, but really having the opportunity to exchange and do things together to build community.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit, in this report, you talk about an Office of Equity and Inclusion, and I'd like to hear you elaborate a little bit about how you think that could help us with reconciliation, how that could help us with this ongoing work, as I see it. I think it's been mentioned here that we can't possibly do all these recommendations. They'll cost too much, they'll take too long. From where I sit, I think this is something that we're, one monument, whatever we do or don't do with it is not going to bring reconciliation. It's not going to fix, I think, what one of my colleagues called our fractured community. So I'm curious how you see an Office of Equity and Inclusion helping us with this work, which we may never stop doing. We may never need to stop doing it. I think this is ongoing important work that we need to continue to work at. And so I'd be interested in from your experience, from your knowledge with this process. If you can share with us why that would be an important thing to work on.
Well, that phrase, Office of Equity and Inclusion, is just one of many in the report that we named. So the department could be called many things, and it is called different things around the country. That comes from what we heard over the course of the project, confirmed by Survey No. 2 about the existence of racism in Santa Fe, like many other all communities. So because the second survey confirmed what we heard, that it exists in Santa Fe and that it needs to be addressed, that's the purpose for having a city department that's dedicated to that, whatever you want to call it. That, as well as the recommendation for Department of Community Engagement, could work very nicely together, because addressing issues of racism and inequity, also addressed in this report, is also about community building. A community is the people who live in it now. That's what a community is. It's every person, and Councilor Lundell, I hear you when you say even those who are yelling about the process are part of a community. Those who wish to take part in community building are the ones who are going to be doing the hard work. People who don't choose to participate choose that, but that doesn't mean that community building can't happen. You cannot build a community without truth-telling and the acknowledgement of the most difficult things that exist in a community. Racism and inequity addressed in the report are just some of the things mentioned. So that department would be charged with that, not only sort of looking for where it exists, but hopefully using all we know in the field, which is a lot right now all over this country and others, to try to make some headway about that in this community, where that, of all the chart participants, is something that needs to be addressed. So whatever you call it, and we think we say in our recommendations, it's very important to look at the best practices elsewhere in the local community or regional community, the state community, elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world. Look at where it's being done well. And those should be the models for how we do it here. And so I think whatever you call that department, that is what that department would be charged with. And again, we speak with the mouths of everyone who heard from that. That is our perspective here. And because it just came up all the time, it just really needs to be a priority.
I'd be curious if you can point to particular places that you think are doing it well. And I won't necessarily put you on the hot seat now, but maybe as a follow-up, if you could, give us an example. I hear my buzzer going. I just wanna,
You said what, Chattanooga?
Chattanooga, yeah, Chattanooga, okay. Just real quick, because my time is up, I also was struck by your statement about the stamina to stay with this work. And I don't think you meant this body staying with this work, although maybe you did. I think actually it's all of us, this whole community sticking with this work. And certainly some of your recommendations, I think, for instance, having an Office of Equity and Inclusion will help us stick with this work, continue to prioritize it, and hopefully give us that stamina. I agree, this body does have a lot of the stamina. We just finished a 10-hour meeting ago that ended at 3 o'clock. So I don't question our stamina on many things, but I think it's a. I was struck by the statement because I think it was an important one, and I think it means all of us need to stick with this, and I think it's ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Your characterization of the work you had been asked to do is, I think, an understatement of the task. It's in my experience, having looked at other cities and other communities where they did do truth and reconciliation commissions and tried other models, I think this is the most remarkable effort I've ever seen. And as you said, it's not perfect, and nor do we pretend to be, none of us pretend to be perfect, but I think the effort and the intelligence and the commitment and the openness of spirit is really what our time demands. This is the work of our time right now. And it's not just the work of Santa Fe, it's the work of our country. If we don't want to fall apart, we have to work together. I only have 10 minutes too, so I have some essay questions that I hope can turn into brief essay questions, and they're really looking for context, because I think a report like this is not a paint by numbers solution document. It is an opportunity for more questions, more dialogue. It's the beginning of an ongoing conversation and giving us guideposts to follow. So I'm going to ask you, with the ability you can, to help me unpack some of these troubling findings. There are two very, very disturbing surveys results. One says that Santa Fe has a problem with racial discrimination, and just about everyone, including 1 out of 5 white people, 4 in 10 Hispanic people, almost 1 out of every 2 African American residents feel discriminated against. At the other finding is that fewer than 50% of people who live here feel they are welcome, if they belong. I would really appreciate, as I say, it's an essay question with a short time frame, help, because we want to do this work, not just in the form of recommendations, but in the form of ongoing mending of our community and of our place. These are really troubling statistics. Can you give us some more context? Because I think the numbers don't explain themselves. So can you give us additional insight into how to make sense of them and then how to address them constructively?
Well, what I would say is we reported what we heard. So that is the truth of what we heard consistently over the course of the project. So because it exists for the participants in the chart process, it exists in terms of the final report. So we don't argue with what we heard. But in terms of how you address that, again, I think for me, it returns to community building. And again, to echo Selena Cermeño and the stamina, is that communities are very complex. And so to address that is complex. And I think that's why the recommendations include the Department of Community Engagement, the department that addresses racism, is that, people need to be with each other. That's also reflected in this report. People wanted more multicultural events, but then in the survey we teased out, which said, you know, do you want more opportunities to engage with people who are different from you? We know there's plenty of research that shows that familiarity with people who have very different, not only just race, ethnicity, background, but also even political points of view. There are some very important work going on in this country, in the Midwest, for example. I can't remember the exact location, that brought together, for example, Democrats and Republicans across from different, I think across state boundaries, right, to engage in dialogue with each other. There's something about this. We are the ones, for those watching, who asked that we all sit at the table like this with each other. There is something that's not only symbolic, but deeply meaningful about sitting around the table, where some people have to hear someone feel impassioned and telling their truth, and us listening to each other through, that is deeply humanizing among people who are different from each other. I believe in not only this work, but I've seen it in Artful Life's work, which is, just to clarify, about art and community development. We work in a particular way in the art sector. The discipline is about community development through the arts. And it's the reason why we chose artists for the team, artists with experience in community development. The arts, for example, are a very powerful way to get people to engage with each other, because to create even a small work of art together, you don't have to agree on your politics. There's something about sitting at the table, eating with people, eating with their families, having children around, maybe making something beautiful together, that is deeply humanizing and deeply meaningful. That can be achieved through dialogue, but sometimes the topic of a dialogue will immediately divide people in a group. That's why the arts are particularly powerful, because the arts can be done without conversation about a topic. I've just used that as an example because those are the things that, in order for communities, especially communities that are challenged with issues of racism, inequity, all sorts of things that make you not feel like you belong. That's how you build a fabric of belonging, and it doesn't happen fast.
And it may have not happened to an earlier point with one big gesture. What you just described are many small moments of people coming together, finding ways to connect and be generous to each other. Many small gestures add up to often a very large change process. So I think we have to look at the recommendations and we have to generate our own path forward. I want to spend time, I've read this report now many times. I want to spend some more time with those two particular findings, because I think they speak to the heart of the matter as to where we are, not just as a city and a community, but as a country. And if we want to be better than and more exemplary than and be a leader in addressing this time of national falling apart, we need to pull back together. And sometimes it takes a crisis to make that happen.
Can I just add one thing? We did have people participate in the chart process who have very strong opinions, very strong, and have been public about those opinions. Not all people who were screaming at all of you and all of us chose not to take part. We had people who never budged in their opinion, but they did take part in the dialogues. And they were not in those dialogues. Of course, they were facilitated well. They also listened. They may not have moved in their opinion, but they sat at the table, they heard each other's stories, and they sat and listened. So the requirement is not always, again, this resolution. It's about being with each other. It's about engaging with each other. I do think on a national level, even though it may seem impossible now, that we can give up on it, but there are demonstrated ways of nurturing that fabric that have to do with engagement with each other.
And I also think we focus as a governing body, we're very conscious of our desire to get something right, to come to the right answer. And I think what I'm seeing in this report is there are many paths to reconciliation. There's not one right answer. It's not you're not putting this report in the toaster and waiting for the answer to pop out. It's not, as I said, a paint by numbers exercise. This is a response to our request for your help to find many ways forward so that the community comes together and we facilitate that, we catalyze that. It's the work of generations. It's the work of people following us in these jobs and the people who will follow them as well. Just as sustainability takes place over decades, community sustainability takes place over decades. I'm going to run out of time in about 1 minute, but I do think, I don't know whether you have any appetite for capacity to do this contextualization. I think the numbers, you come back to the numbers and the data and the voices you heard, and I respect that. The larger question for us is, for me as mayor, is this sense-making effort to see beyond the data, to see through the data into what the stories are behind the data that the people are trying to tell us. I think Councilor Chavez says people want to be heard, they want to be recognized, they want to be seen. And maybe racism or a lack of belonging is a feeling that also means I don't feel seen, I don't feel respected or recognized. And that ultimately doesn't just boil down to a vote on the soldier's monument. It becomes a city task to give everybody their due and to show everybody respect and not call anybody out.
Safety is also important in that,
Yeah,
and that people express a lot of reasons why they don't feel they belong. If they're not reflected in works of art, if they don't feel that they're heard, if they feel that loud voices dominate the public sphere, that their voices aren't heard. But it's also about safety. So that if there's issues of equity, right, there's so much here, but also safety. And we heard during the course of the project, people who were afraid to state their point of view loudly because they were going to be yelled down or they were going to be critiqued for their point of view, but also safety. And so if you don't feel safe in your community, you don't feel like you belong. So there are many reasons why people express this lack of belonging. So you have to be able to work on these many fronts, right? So it's not just in the arts field. We're talking about housing as we address in the report, and gentrification, all the things that came up in that survey 2 question. So you have to have the ability to have all those balls in the air, but have a kind of philosophy. The reason why we addressed in the racism section that the Department of, Equity, Inclusion, whatever you want to call it, it would be best if Santa Fe just honestly acknowledged that it has a problem with racism and discrimination. Now, somebody told me after that couldn't actually do that necessarily in the mission and purpose of the department because you could get into legal trouble for saying that. But the thing is that we, be brave about saying, this is what we're struggling with, and we acknowledge it, and let's all work together. And if you have enough people working, people say it won't work, I don't want to work with you, whatever. If you have a core group of people who are working and doing the work and using the stamina to do that, I do believe a community can move forward. It's our only hope, actually, in our communities or in our country, because if not, we just give up now, because the national atmosphere right now is very, very troubling.
it's toxic. I think we have the opportunity, and we've shown we're capable of doing it, of meeting the challenge and acknowledging our mistakes, not just current mistakes, but the mistakes of the past, and not getting into what a friend of mine calls the Olympics of suffering, but to acknowledge there's been enough suffering to go around. Now it's time to move to healing and a sense of a better future for our kids. And your report, I think, is really an important milestone, and I appreciate you taking on this challenge. I know you, as you said, we were cautioned against it. Of course, everybody on the governing body was cautioned against running for office too. So it's something we all share in common. We're at the 3 o'clock mark.
We have 7 minutes each if we go around, 7.5.
Well, we could go another round, or we could talk to each other and discuss some of the takeaways that rise to the surface as a governing body. We haven't had a dialogue among each other. We've addressed everything toward our consultant advisors and unpackers. It's not a public hearing. So the challenge now is it's a choice for the governing body. We can spend some time addressing whatever rises to the surface for each of us. For the next hour, we have a hard stop at 4. If the preference would be to go another one more time around, I'm open to that as well. I don't really have a game plan for how we can best use this time. I do believe that we are, as has been said, and we all agree, I think we're challenged to take action. And finding our way forward is the next order of business. And doing that collectively, we don't get a chance to do that other than in a public meeting, because we would violate the open meetings law if we didn't do it collectively and in a public and transparent way. So, Councilor Cassidy?
I want to cut observations that I wanted to say, and maybe that is part of the
Well,
dialogue. Of the
Let's start a dialogue among ourselves, and you're welcome to, you don't have to suddenly excuse yourselves, but I think if we wanted to have a dialogue with each other in public, in a transparent and open way, we have an hour to talk to each other. That's a rare gift, we have an hour to just talk to each other.
Yeah.
So you have the floor.
Well,
But I also, we were very good about holding as much as possible with 10 minutes. If you said everybody gets 7.5 minutes to summarize, let's try to do that. That's a great model. It's just whatever your thoughts are from today's interaction, but also moving forward, how you will see some next steps.
Mayor, am I timing this still, or?
Yeah, if you don't mind, give us 7 minutes per person and tell us when the eggs are done.
Yeah, I like that.
I like my soft boiled eggs a little on the runny side.
you're in my time.
Go.
Claiming my time.
I cede you back my minute. You have the floor.
So, one of the pieces of conversation has been how there are so many recommendations here and how do we possibly start to take them on. A couple things that I've noticed in reading the report and reading the recommendations. One, to me, it looks like there's a lot of crossover. And so while there might be, 52 total, I think that there are a lot of things that actually fit really well together. But what I was even more encouraged by was that there's a lot that we are already doing. We just need to be looking at how we're doing it. And so there were these conversations that came up about the general plan. Well, guess what? We already funded that. That's something that is moving forward. We just had conversations about that and quality of life. And this timing is really perfect, in the sense that now there is this information that really can start to feed that. In EDAC, we've had conversations, Economic Development and Advisory Committee. I apologize for my alphabet soup. We have had conversations that, as the department staffs up, that we'll be moving forward with, looking at the economic development strategic plan for the city. And a lot of what I was hearing almost underneath was something that is unfortunately not unique to our community. There are a lot of these large societal issues that are very challenging, that we are seeing nationwide, of displacement, of lack of opportunity, or inequitable opportunity. That seemed to me kind of really came out, and that the information in this report does provide that opportunity for us to make sure that we are taking this lens as we go about the business of the things that we would normally be doing. The art in public places, well, we will be discussing a budget adjustment today that would put money into each district for art in public places. And so for me, I think what was kind of encouraging is that there are things that we already have moving. And so how do we start to take this information and these concepts and put them in? The Office of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, with the various names that it has. I think that that's a really interesting concept and an important one. How I saw it phrased in the report was more, taking a look at specific events and histories, but I almost see this as a way that we might be able to bring in, a mechanism by which we could bring in expertise in this area. And it not just inform some of these outward facing events, activities, but also be a resource internally in the city in the things that we do. And so as we explore potentially the development of this office, of the, how we would look at community engagement, we do have a community engagement department right now, and how we are looking at how that functions. It is a new department, so of course there will be tweaks that we will need to make. But that the community engagement piece can't be, and the diversity and equity and inclusion can't be siloed to one department in our government, because really these issues are hitting across the city. I mean, when we're updating our sustainability plans or our water plans, or, really these tenants need to come in because these are larger issues. I also started to think about kind of these, opportunities for conversations, and where we already do have, where we already do have the infrastructure of where are the places that we can be pulling these things in. The library always does such great programming, but I think frequently people come to a library program and then they leave. How do we start to bring people in and then keep them there? Usually it's food tends to keep people in places. And that's, as I kind of listen to these tenets of what are people looking for, and people are looking for connection, and they're looking for community. And it will continue to be a challenge. I mean, if we talk about history, part of history is that we have to learn from it. We will always be fractured in some way, shape, or form. I don't think that there is an example in history of a community that does not have some type of fracture. The question becomes, how deep is that? How insurmountable is that? And how do we help to address it when it occurs? Councilor Chavez, I believe, was the one who brought up this conversation about how we bring in our community partners, and I think that is crucial. And the role of where government comes in, and again, I think that if we do a good job with this Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and really getting some experts who are in this field and truly understand kind of what this work looks like, and the fact that it's messy, and I mean that in a Van Gogh beautiful painting sort of way, not in a my child's room this morning sort of way, but really that there is, a way that the mess does become something that there is value in it. So I think that and when I'm looking at hard steps moving forward, one, really looking at that office, how do we really bring this to every piece of the city? How do we look at what we're already doing? Because there are calls to action that are already happening, and I think that we need to be looking at where are we not addressing these issues in the actions that we are already taking. And then how do we bring in our community partners? It's really interesting, these kind of cultural events. I don't believe that the city actually hosts any of these. We support other organizations. Fiesta is not put on by us, it's put on by the Fiesta Council. They spend all year creating this incredible community. Zozobra and Dia de los Muertos, and all of these are really put on by other organizations. And so the question is, how do we partner with those community organizations if they do not feel that they have a mechanism by which they can be publicly sharing their culture? How do we find them and work with them? I think my timer just went off, so I will yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Garcia?
Yes, we're going in the same order. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
I figured that, but
It was a challenge, but I figured on the spur of the moment to stay with what worked last time.
thank you very much. So appreciate the information and the dialogue that we're having here today, because I think that, you're right, without us all being here together, we can express not only our point of views of what we see is what we read in the information that was presented, but also that of what we're getting from our community constituents of people that live there. And, I'm the first to always say that change is not an optional event in our society. Change happens. How we adapt to change and how we do it, to respect and to include people. And I think there was a lot of conversation here about inclusivity. It almost seems as if, I wish we wouldn't even be in this situation with what's happened to our soldiers monument. And yet we're here trying to figure out what are we gonna do with this. I'm not necessarily certain that this report is something that is going to influence what we should or should not do with the soldiers monument. Because I go back to page 85 of this report, and it seems like it's almost 50-50. Okay, so who do we listen to? What do we do on behalf of our community? Because that's who we represent, our community. The majority of people that speak to me are, let's put it back the way it is. One, let's change some things to make it more inclusive to people, and some of these questions have been asked. And so, you know, who are we trying to appease by either doing something completely different with it, or bringing it back the way it was, or doing something completely inclusive of both sides. And so I look at it also from a very, very historical aspect in the fact that we are an old city. And it's a part of us for the last 200+ years. And so that being said, we are a living museum. And our past is our present, because that's who we are. And when you bring people to Santa Fe and they love Santa Fe for its cultural aspects and for everything that's happening here. And yet it's starting to change. And on that note, that's where I kind of have issues. I heard mention of our monuments, our Cross of the Martyrs, our statues, everything that's in this city. I just heard it. Those could be on the table for us to at some point change because of the direction that we might be listening to here. Now, I believe that everybody should have their proper input because different perspectives obviously always usually come to the best possible solution. And if we can agree to disagree, but choose to move forward in a way that is what's best for our community. I think that we have a lot of work to do. And I don't necessarily feel that if we listen to those that bark the loudest is always the right solution. A lot of time the silent majority is really where it lies. And I mean, what would happen if we were to take this decision to the public? 3 choices on the next ballot. Build it back, replace it, I don't know. Who would show up to vote for that? And again, here we are with this very, very difficult decision to make. However, I think it is time that we get moving on this because we need to make a decision on it. And I want to be a part of that. And then obviously I am. That's why I was elected into office last go round. And you know, I just really feel that I appreciate the report. I think there's a lot of valuable information that's in there. You take a report for the information that it gives, but you also have to listen to the overall consensus of our people that have lived in this city for generations upon generations. And they have a voice too, and a lot of times they're very timid in being involved in processes like this. Because again, they feel, well, I'm not gonna go participate, I'm not gonna be hurt. It happens in voting, we see it every day. I talk to people all the time, I'm not gonna go vote, nothing changes anyway. And my answer to them is, you should participate and go vote because, well, there's nobody to vote for. Whatever. But the bottom line is participate, be involved with this process. You know, obviously, realize that we live in such a diverse area, from the Native American pueblos surround us. I grew up amongst Nambe Pueblo, Tesuque Pueblo, San Alfonso Pueblo, Okeominge Pueblo, you can name them all. They're all my brothers and sisters that live here. And so, you know, getting their information and input is really valuable to me as well. Not just, and I understand the whole issue of art, and how it affects us in our daily lives. And so I think I've said a mouthful, I'm almost at my 7 minutes. But I think dialogue is definitely important. I realize and I hope that everyone's voices are heard. And it's time to make a decision on this and move forward with what we're gonna do with that soldiers monument and statues and how we listen to our community. And so with that, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And you were within your 7 minutes, you beat the clock.
7-11, I got it.
Thank you.
Travis?
Thank you. You know, the idea of this Office of Equity and Inclusion, and I would add accessibility, is really something that stands out to me because we keep hearing about how there's a lot of recommendations. There's some recommendations that I think as a governing body, as local government, we have to act on, but I also think that there's recommendations that would need to sit in this office because it would help us navigate most appropriately in the community we're representing and making the decisions for. And I say accessibility because I think there are other groups that we haven't heard from, like our youth, our seniors, our disabled. And I think that we can transform and move in a direction that promotes a Santa Fe for them more appropriately. I also, in regards to the monument, this idea of multiculturalism, I think as leaders, we have to confess to the fact that we are not proficient in multiculturalism. I think it's something that is very hard to be proficient at in understanding. And I will say, as born and raised in Santa Fe, I thought I knew Santa Fe. I thought I knew everything about Santa Fe. I thought that, you know, these are my roots. Like, how can anyone know more than me? Born and raised, my parents were born and raised. My family has deep history here. And then I was put in a community that completely redefined Santa Fe for me. It was a silenced community. It was a community I had to learn to serve. And I had no idea it existed the way that it did. I had no idea how ignored and underrepresented it was because I had to pick up for that as a community leader within that community. And so I hear like the 50-50, when I keep hearing like the thoughts on the monument are 50-50, what about the other portion that's completely silenced because it's not significant to them? And so it's just so important. And I keep hearing Councilwoman Renee Villarreal, who's probably the most proficient in multiculturalism than if anyone I know, talking about this office having to exist separate from government in this way, if at all possible. And I agree. I feel like then the reason why I asked about community partners earlier was because of the fact that the community partners that we have in Santa Fe represent the different subgroups that we have. They've built trust and they've done the work already that would be very challenging for us to do and would prolong any healing process. They've established a meaningful relationship. And if they could have influence in a department, they would have to have influence and drive the work of a department. And I would see that department advising the city, serving as an advisor on decisions we should make, so we are representing those who have no voice. Because this represents people that have voice. The whole time that I look at those data points, I'm thinking about my community that I served as a school leader, and none of their voices are represented in there. And it's not because of anyone doing any harm or not doing things appropriately or not being intentional. It's just because they don't even have roots in Santa Fe yet to have a voice. Like, we haven't set that up for them. They wouldn't know what to choose or not because they haven't defined their past, present, and future in this city. We haven't provided that opportunity, and I don't know how. I leaned on community partners as a school leader to do that. I let them guide me, and I think that's what we need. Like, we need to be vulnerable in the sense that we don't know. We don't know every subgroup. We don't have the understanding of multiculturalism to necessarily even lead the action completely with all recommendations. And we need to know that so we could be properly led by people that do. And fortunately, which is kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel for me, is we're rich in those partners. Like, we are incredibly rich. I asked about alignment because the challenge with the partners is they're not aligned. But there is a beauty and an opportunity that comes with that. Because I think it shines light that it's not going to be just one path. We're going to have to create multiple paths and multiple responses and a diverse set of opportunities to meet the diverse needs of Santa Fe. But yeah, I keep hearing your brilliant voice in my head in regards to this office, and then that it needs to exist, but it needs to exist in a way that it is community driven. And that we function in a way that it can call us out when we're not being driven the right way and serving the community. So just emphasizing on that, I really just want us as a governing body to reflect on that fact. Santa Fe is incredibly diverse. Our communities celebrate their culture in the most beautiful ways. But just because we see these celebrations or we participate in these celebrations, we do not know what their culture means to them. And that's a very unsettling fact when we're having to make decisions to represent those cultures. And so are we the ones to make those decisions, or do we create something that could work with the people that are the right people to make those decisions for our community? And so that's where I'm at, and kind of this idea of an office and really taking on these recommendations and heading in a direction. We're gonna have to lean on the experts, and I'm not sure if they're in this room collectively, because it's the community that kind of defines what that is. So I yield the floor. Just wanted to emphasize that, and thank you.
Thank you. Joseph?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'll begin with following what Councilor Chavez said. Running an office of diversity, equity, and inclusion is must. I mean, it's something Councilwoman Villarreal has been saying needs to be done since at least I've been here, and I think that's what we need to get done. Start understanding what the framework looks like, where it's going to sit, because it can serve two purposes. Obviously, right now we're focusing on the external purpose, how it's serving the public, but we need to ensure we also have that internal focus as well. And so I think we need to begin to look at the framework and implement this, and maybe we can get this pushed through in the next year's budget, where we begin to develop, whether it's strategizing, putting money to strategize what it looks like. I have no idea, but I'm happy to work with anybody that wants to figure out how we stand up this office. Maybe you have an internal facing component and the external facing component, but it's a must. That is, we're behind the clock on this. This is something that's implemented in every bureaucracy across the country. Councilor Garcia said earlier, we need to address what's going on with the monuments and statues. It's past due. as Councilwoman Villarreal said, we are fractured, and the fracture only continues day by day by day, that we don't do anything. That boxes on the plaza and monuments and statues continue to be vandalized. I mean, recently, the Cross of the Martyrs, twice in one weekend. Kit Carson, just within the past month. That's only going to continue until we, as a community, say, we're not going to tolerate that anymore. And we, as the community leaders, need to stand up and say, enough is enough. We hear everybody, let's bring people together collectively and address these issues. And so I think it's a big task. How do we figure out how we move forward with soldiers' monuments? I'm glad to hear today that we've determined it's city-owned. Madam City Attorney, are we 100% on that?
That sounds very good. It's hard to be 100% certain of anything. But that is the only information I have. I have zero contradictory sources of information.
Okay, and the only reason I ask is because when prior governing bodies were faced with this challenge, nearly 50 years ago, their opinion was different, that it was state-owned, and that's why they couldn't take the actions that they wanted to take back then. So I'd want us to ensure that we are confident in whatever direction we move, that we know ownership. Because I think for us to go down a path with the frame of reference that we think the city owns it, and then there's lawsuits that will counter that and potentially put us back at square one. So I think whether it's going back and looking at historical records, I'm sure we can figure that out, who owns it, but that needs to be determined. That's a priority. I think that is an answer that needs to be before we even move forward. And if we can't get that, then we can't move forward. And I think the public needs to understand that. The hurt that folks felt when that monument was destroyed, the joy that folks felt when the monument was destroyed, to me, it just shines a light on how much work needs to be done in our city amongst our community members. I wish we had folks that were critical players come to the table to really provide their perspective on why folks are giving their position on why the monument should stand up, why it shouldn't. And I think that's what I was hoping would come through this process. I was hoping you'd have folks come and publicly people would be aware of, oh, this is why they're so adamant it needs to stay up. This is why they're so adamant it needs to come down. And I think that's not what happened. We had a lot of conversation, we gathered a lot of data, but a lot of the healing wasn't done. And that's evident just through the division that continues. And by addressing Soldiers Monument, I think once that's done, whatever happens, as some of my colleagues said earlier, we're not going to have a happy community, but that's the first step that needs to happen. That is critical. Whether stays or goes, that is the first step that needs to happen, and we need to move the ball forward. And we didn't do that. We ended up with the same results we knew. And I think I urge us as a body to figure out how we continue to press moving that ball forward. If that means commissioning a new process to determine how we move that, or as Counselor Garcia said, we punt it to the voters. We need to figure out what that looks like. With that, Ms. Martinez, Ms. Garab, Ms. Kaminsky, I really thank your time and effort and the rest of the facilitators. This is a heavy lift, lots of information, lots of paths for us to move forward. I appreciate that. And with that, I urge us, let's roll up our sleeves and let's get to work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Keep doing that.
It's a
I
trap.
will follow that at you. Actually, that's a good point, Counselor Garcia. And maybe you can answer that because we did see people say they wanted it back, the monument, to keep the monument or rebuild it or remove it completely, the obelisk. So did we have responses as to why, like the reasonings behind people's opinions about that?
Yeah, that's in the report.
Like in detail about,
Yeah, I
can
think
you
so.
direct us on which pages those were?
Let's see, so page 85 is the section on Soldiers Monument.
I also have to consider that from the-
Yes.
So these IDs, these numbers, is that what you mean, the?
Well, in the report, if you look at page 86, it says, in terms of the two most favored options, 33% of respondents recommend replace what's left of the monument with something else. This opinion is reflected in the data collected before the second survey. Reasons for taking this stand coalesced around the following. Soldiers Monument was created and erected during the time of the Indian Wars, and its accompanying language reflects the racist attitudes and actions that led to the enslavement and genocide of indigenous people. Second point, the phrase, quote, savage Indians, unquote, regardless of being scratched out, is so offensive that even its echo or memory should have no place in this or any other public place in the city or county of Santa Fe. As one chart participant articulated this, quote, any word or any part of history that hurts someone or their race should not be flaunted in any way, be it a piece of art or plaque, end quote. Soldiers Monument has been controversial for decades and continues to spark divisions in the Santa Fe community. Removing the monument and replacing it with something else would promote truth, healing, and reconciliation. Another 31.68% of respondents recommend, quote, restore the monument with its original signage and add language that encourages it to be fully understood and assessed, end quote. Original signage includes the language of the 4 1867 marble tablets with, quote, to the heroes who have fallen in the various battles with the savage Indians of the territory of New Mexico, end quote. During public dialogue, most participants who recommended this option were aware that the original language is problematic and or offensive and or racist. Even so, they cited the following reasons for choosing this option. Soldiers Monument honors Hispanic and Pueblo veterans who sacrificed their lives in the war to end Black slavery. The monument represents relationships, a quote, brotherhood, end quote, as several chart participants articulated it, between Hispanic and Pueblo peoples. History should reflect, quote, the good, the bad, and the ugly, end quote, as one chart participant wrote, including the original 1867 signage with new contextual language allows residents and visitors to simultaneously engage with the complexity of the monument and acknowledge why many find it offensive. And just as in the earlier, restoring a monument with contextual signage will promote truth, healing, and reconciliation. It is also important to note that for most, Soldiers Monument is a reflection of historical truths that are complex, nuanced, and contradictory. Hundreds of recommendations from chart participants, see Appendix G, suggest sources of historical information, including written records and oral stories that we are urged to consult as we move forward with any process around Soldiers Monument obelisk.
Thank you. Thanks for referencing that. And these were coming from the dialogues themselves,
All of the data, including the
dialogues,
surveys.
not just both survey and dialogue.
And also, we make a note that on survey 2, over the course of the project, 7 options came up. And that's why in survey 2, there were 7 options in that question. I think it's question 15 to be answered in survey 2, 18, sorry. And so what the data did was give us the information to present the question options in survey 2, and these are the statistics from that. So a lot of the work has been done to bring us down to the 2 most favored options. And as you can hear from these are the reasons stated overall for those options.
Thank you for finding the page. I know I looked at that, but that's helpful to hear the different perspectives. And I mean, there is actually a history that former historian Esteban Galvez, Rael Galvez, wrote in, I think it was The Medium was the actual document, and it actually, it's pretty long, but it actually gives a pretty thorough explanation of the histories of obelisks in general across the country and the nationalist movement that was happening then. And I think that was helpful. I don't think a lot of people read it or had access to it. It was an online document. So
Shared on that chart blog. It's,
I'm just thinking, like, if you weren't part of the process.
It's mentioned in the final report.
I hope the public reads that document. It's actually, or not document, it's a historic, what would you call it? Historic essay
Yeah.
about it. So that was helpful for me, and I want to refresh my memory about it because there was a lot of rich information about that. I'm gonna or switch gears, but I kept thinking about the recommendations and how it really will inform our city department structure and processes. And I'm curious, I don't know who would be able to answer this out of our departments, but really it comes down to, at least from the recommendations, the arts and culture department will take a big role in, defining public art, and then also as it relates to monuments. There was an explanation of how the community engagement department could be restructured. It talked about land use and acknowledging that they need to look at the racial and other inequities as it relates to the general plan, and then the potential of creating a new Department of Equity and Inclusion, or whatever name it comes to be, if that does move forward. And so I don't know who would know, but do the departments, have they been informed that these were some of the things that came about that would affect their departments? I don't know who would be able to answer that, but.
Mayor, Councilman, we haven't done any specific outreach or round recommendations to see if we'll staff beyond that. At the same time, the chart report and its impact recommendations are widely known about the staff. So it's not a chance for us to be more deliberate with them as we begin to look at the budget year. But we can do that.
Yeah, I think it'd be important because that will affect budgets, and then also, how we do our work moving forward. And then Councilor Garcia actually took, it's like you read my notes, but I do see the Office of Equity and Inclusion was inward facing and outward facing, and that it would need to be separate from elected officials. It would have to, if we're making recommendations and for the general public, and also it would have to be a community resource, but it would also have to look inward and be like, what does the city need to do so that we need to improve our ways of being more inclusive and equitable in just what we do in city business, not just how we interact with the public, but how we interact with each other. So it really would need to be separate. I'm curious about the models. I know Seattle has been a model that has seemed to work. You said Chattanooga, Albuquerque. I'm interested to learn more about how it's working for them. Because from what I've heard, they do hold their city staff accountable, and they do make recommendations, and then they're also outward facing with the public. So want to learn more about that. And I guess when I think about the recommendations about multicultural events, I just want to caution us, because from what I've heard from public members is that we shouldn't tokenize certain ethnic groups or cultural groups just by having events that are supposed to represent them. And I think that's something to make sure that we don't do. I think I talked about this in the last meeting about the tricultural myth. It leaves out a whole other ethnic groups that are part of our, that have been part of our history in Santa Fe. And so, and then simultaneously, talking about what colonization means. I think all of us got a letter, that colonization isn't a bad thing. And it's a part of history, but it actually does have negative connotations if you understand the definition. And I think we need to understand what that means. And the fact that we refer to colonization in a binary way, we think about it from, we talk about the Spanish colonization, but we don't talk about Anglo colonization. And I know Councilor Garcia brought that up in the last meeting. I think it comes in a different form that's hard to specifically pinpoint and say this race and this race. It's really like colonization can come in a form of displacement and gentrification of our communities. And it would be great to have somewhere to go to, whether it's a museum about the history of Santa Fe, a place where we can actually read about the nuances of our history that do describe what it has looked like for our city and how it's changed because of displacement and different ways of colonization. Because we never acknowledge that. It's really frustrating. And even in the, I don't know if it's in the document per se, maybe later on you could reference it for me if there is. I just think the waves of colonization are complex. With them come good things, with them come bad things. And I want us to have a place where we can actually learn about that in a safe place where people feel welcome. And I don't know where that lies. I do think, and I'll say this again, in our tourism description of Santa Fe, for the outward public, it's, I don't like how we describe Santa Fe. It's very simplified. We can do a better job. I talked to the director about this in tourism. And maybe you all have recommendations of who can actually help with that to rewrite if we need to. That's an easy one that we can start with. So, yeah.
Thank you. Councilor Linda?
Thank you, Mayor. I have another question I wanted to ask. We had about 1,400 participants. Is that right?
1372.
1372. Oh boy, math, 1,400.
Don't continue to call me.
Sorry. At any point, did we have a consideration that that wasn't enough participants to show true significance?
Well, there are two ways I'd answer that. So the sample actually is pretty large. If you looked at the last 2 weeks in the Albuquerque Journal, right, they shown the results of several polls. And if you looked at the numbers of those polls, whether you take those seriously or not, so I'm not arguing for that, all of them were under 520 people. So you can look at those and say, well, they mean nothing. They are supposed to poll the residents of the state of New Mexico and predict where, you know, the candidates are. So it's actually, you know, having 1% of the population in a very short contract of 12 months, which is actually about 10 months, maybe 11, because we had to produce the report and, you know, consolidate all that information. So I would argue that it's actually a pretty good sample for the duration of the contract. Also for the effort that we made in terms of participation and the diversity of participation. So you can agree with that or not agree with that. But I think what's important is because we had a diversity of people who participated and certainly a diversity of points of view along the spectrum, I think that the report is worth taking seriously. Not only were there 1372 participants, unique participants, as we can calculate it, but there are 10,000 engagements. And so engagements, Denise mentioned, for example, the blog. In other words, people who watched the YouTube videos, people who engaged with the blog and read all those blog postings. So the chart project was the engagement of dialogue, but many, many other things. So the 10,000 engagements are repeat engagements, but engagements on all of those platforms, which is quite significant. So it's harder to measure how somebody felt about watching a YouTube video, but they watched those videos or they read those blogs. And I would argue, and Denise can talk more because she was in charge of that beautiful blog, is very, very diverse in the information that it presents in the books that it suggests. So I think that that's the only thing I can say is we worked extremely hard to engage people in the project. And we worked extremely hard to engage them in very different ways, in multimodal approaches. And we had a lot of engagement with the project, which we couldn't necessarily measure in terms of unique participants. Whether you agree with that or not will be up to all of you and those that are watching, but I will argue that I think that for the duration of the project, we actually had quite a bit of participation.
But we don't know of the 1,400, how many of them were, like a one and done, or how many of them participate? We do know?
We do know, we have our administrative
So
assistant
we
has
have-
a giant spreadsheet with every single person who participated, where their name was actually, given. And every single event, whether it was a January dialogue, a February dialogue, a March dialogue, wherever a cultural history series, if we took their names and so on and so forth. So we do know across, that's how we actually had to figure out the number of unique participants, the 1372, rather than looking at it, so we know who was, if we took a name, as it were, we know who they were and what they came to.
But there are plenty of events where, for example, the opening ceremony and the very big family event that we had in July. It was a park with kids' games and, you know what I mean? We didn't stop everybody and take their names and stuff. So I think that's, with any community engagement process, there will be the knowns and there will be the unknowns, right?
I think that's right. I'm just, oftentimes, we do get chastised for only listening to, the loudest voices. And statistically, I don't know if, we have a population of about 84,000, so we're a little under 2%. And when you made the comparison with the election polling, they selected demographic with that. This was an open casting call. This was whomever. But, I'm just asking about that because oftentimes we do hear about, well, you only listen to the loudest voices in the room. So, it's still a consideration.
It's
Thank
sort of
you.
like one of the things that we talk about, and that's again, the recommendation about the Department of Community Engagement talks about the painstaking work of a department like that to engage thousands of Santa Feans, right? It takes a long time through partner organizations, through outreach and other ways that you can do that work. It takes some effort, it takes some funding, it takes some time. The polls are supposed to be statistical, right? Be samples, right, of the population of New Mexico. They're supposed to represent the diversity of New Mexico. So again, we're looking at 520 or fewer and all of that. So all to say, yes, if we'd had more time, we would have reached more people. In terms of the loudest voices, I guess the question goes to all of you. So how do you engage with your constituents in your districts? How do you ensure that the people that are talking to you are representative of the people in your districts? Political campaigns do it, right? They go door to door, they have town hall meetings, they do focus groups, they do all of that work, right? The work of community engagement is like that without the politics. How do you employ all of those methods? So we worked hard at that. We were stymied until March with the pandemic. So that also was a factor in this as we address in the report. But for the most part, that's painstaking work, but it does work to engage more of the people who are your constituents or the community that you're working.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you, Mayor. So we have 10 minutes left. I will be fairly quick. I know the mayor probably wants his 7 minutes as well, and we only have 10, so I guess it's split it.
You can have all of them.
I just want to thank you all for the work. I want to thank the governing body for this conversation, and the willingness to respect each other's time and listen to each other and our different points of view. I think that's been constructive. I also want to say this report is done. We have had now 2 presentations with Artful Life. I have been waiting for us to have this second one. I think now it is incumbent on us to move forward, and make some decisions, take some action. And I think, you know, we have a process through the governing body, where we can present ideas and start to move things forward. And I think we need to start doing that now. I am not really in favor of taking the what to do with the obelisk to the voters. I don't think that that is going to, I think we know from the work that's been done, it's a divisive issue. And it's just going to create more angst in the community. I think we have been elected to make decisions. I think we need to make them. And what I'll be looking for in the solutions as we go forward are things that cut across constituencies, that provide solutions that help us tell a fuller, more comprehensive rendition of our history, of the people who make up our community. And I think also that this is ongoing work. And I think we've heard today that an Office of Equity and Inclusion and Accessibility, I think are resonating with this group. And I think that's something we need to take very seriously about how that looks and where we put it and what it does, inward facing, outward facing, internal, external. I think those are great ideas. We did that with the Women's Commission. I think the Women's Commission has been charged with looking at how we do things internally as well as what we can be doing externally. So I think we do have some, at least models of things, and I'm very interested in how other communities have created these things and what they do. So with that, that's kind of my focus, and you got 5 minutes. So.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. This has been a most constructive work session, and I really appreciate everybody's participation and good interchange, good exchange, good, not just questions, but good conversations, constructive conversation. I continue to think that we're operating at several different levels simultaneously, which is what the work of our time is about. We have to be mindful of concrete suggestions, recommendations that can be implemented and will make a difference and demonstrate our seriousness of purpose. We also have to be aware of the underlying themes, the kind of through lines that really is the work, rather than just a thing. It's the work that goes on. It's the difference between fence poles and the fence connections that run between the poles. We need to do both. And we have in this document many helpful suggestions about ways forward. And we have among ourselves ideas as well that aren't in this document. Things from experience with other jurisdictions, with other organizations, with other nonprofit operations that we can go to school on. I think the time is absolutely right for us to take leadership as a community on coming to terms with history, facing ourselves, facing many histories, not just one, and acknowledging the validity of everybody's point of view. That's what this exercise was designed to do, was to give everybody voice and everybody respect and everybody a chance to be heard. For me, it is, yes, about the obelisk, but much more than that. And I'm concerned that if it turns into a what do we do on the plaza decision, we will have missed the bigger picture here, which is who do we want to be as a city going forward? And what are the many different ways that we express ourselves to our kids and our grandkids, and to the people who are watching us and looking for leadership. This is a moment where the country is poised to either fall apart or come together. We're relitigating the Civil War. We are challenging people's fundamental rights, and we are seeing other cities absolutely decommission themselves. in fundamental ways. We are not that city. We've in the past risen to these challenges and found ways to reinforce the best in us and each other. I think this is a map, but it's not the territory. Territory is our city. And when we go out and visit with people, we should continue to talk about opportunities to do more, to do it better, and to have more dialogues, and to align more partners, to recognize what everybody can bring to the work of the next years and decades. It's absolutely the time for action. It's absolutely the time to take seriously where we can quickly implement things, to demonstrate our seriousness of purpose, and then to produce processes that will continue this work. And each of us, with our elected office and our own personal relationships, to be advocates for healing and for respect for everybody's point of view. I think the opportunity to do a constellation of activities that speaks to the multiplicity of ways to make a difference in our community is why all of these recommendations need to be taken seriously. And what we do with the obelisk on the plaza will ultimately receive an enormous amount of attention, and we'll do our best. At the same time, the way we make that decision more acceptable to everybody is by the constellation of decisions that we surround it with that demonstrate that we're taking everybody's interests to heart. And it's not a zero-sum game around one monument. We will do our very, very best to be sensitive, to listen, to respect, to understand to the best of our ability how strongly people feel about that one monument and about the statue of Don Diego. And yet there's so many other things that on a day-to-day basis, people are looking to us to do better and to demonstrate that we can make a difference and that Santa Fe can be a leader in this national moment of crisis, of democracy, and of overall community well-being. So you've given us an enormous amount to work with, probably more than we know. There's more work that could be untangled or brought to the surface, but I think this document will live as a testimony to the courage of the city of Santa Fe to try to do the right thing in a very hard time. And we don't have to agree with it to be proud of it. And that's part of Santa Fe as well. So thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for a really constructive work session. I think we demonstrated that we do have the ability to sit down and respectfully talk through points of serious difficulty and ongoing challenge. So my gratitude to everybody, and we will continue to move forward. We'll work together and bring it through the processes that exist to channel recommendations and then action. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
It is
Matt.
4 o'clock. We are on time and we are adjourned.